Hey, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, the right and the left are locked in a battle over the murkily defined critical race theory, a line of academic inquiry that lingered on the fringes of the radical left for years, but has recently been popularized as a catch-all term for its newly mainstream offspring. Spurred by COVID-era revelations of curriculum content, several states are considering or have already passed legislation aimed at purging these teachings from public schools. So now the debate is about freedom of speech and expression, a conflict that continues to mount with each passing day. It seems to me some of the proposals go too far, while some of them are merely unobjectionable enhancements of pre-existing civil rights protections. But if we take a step back from the fray, two important realities crystallize. The first is a decadent but existential linguistic conflict over basic but essential definitions. The second is both sides' newfound love for speech codes, which they should be impelled to embrace openly rather than with a feigned zeal for the First Amendment. It would be basically impossible to teach, quote, critical race theory in a literal sense to elementary-aged children. This is what allows bad faith cultural progressives like Joy Reid to claim the war on CRT is fighting a straw man, and leaders like Randy Weingarten to claim the war on CRT is merely a war on history. Sadly, we are so enormously polarized that the abject racism being peddled in the name of social justice is not roundly laughed off, but it's actually defended by avowed and sincere opponents of racism. And the media is so corrupted by the poison of groupthink, it confuses that debate by mounting tortured defenses of that racism. Take this example from the Evanston-Skokie School District in Illinois. In 2020, quote, the district told teachers they must investigate their whiteness, accept that white individuals are loud and controlling, acknowledge that white identity is inherently racist, and believe that to be less white is to be less racially oppressive, Chris Rufo found. Now that's plainly racist, attributing inferior characteristics on the basis of race. It's not even something that a lot of civil rights activists would cite on to. But it's a pretty representative flavor of the curricula that's popped up in public schools around the country, landing in the classrooms of very young children, not only college students. Now, a clip of Mark Lamont Hill debating Liz Wheeler went viral over the weekend. Wheeler asked Hill if all white people were racist. He said yes.
Do you believe that? Do you believe all white people are inherently racist?
So I don't know if you're backing me into a corner with that question, but yes, I do.
Okay, so that's actually a positive development because it would be disingenuous for him to say anything otherwise. Rufo again pointed out this is pretty obviously a core tenet of the popular critical race theory as we define it, if we accept that label. Their elite acolytes may not be comfortable articulating the only logical conclusion of these teachings, but it's pretty clear in the text. So that's all well and good. The problem is that these formulations of, quote, white supremacy are new to most of the country. So leveling them against the entire white population is tantamount to implicating them in rightfully stigmatized and despicable worldviews. This definition of white supremacy intentionally expands the term beyond neo-Nazi groups to everyday people who aren't actively engaged in so-called anti-racism, which often looks to them more like plain racism. This is how we get tangled up in knots. The question isn't whether racism is bad, it's how to define something we all agree is bad. And so a top-line, highly charged issue in our political discourse is impossible to really talk about because we don't agree on the basic definition, and we don't even realize we don't agree on that. I'll add, not for the sake of scoring points, but for the sake of clarity, that the left is actively and openly seeking to expand these definitions, which is what sparks all of the outrage. People who don't believe in racial superiority may be insensitive. The new left defines that as racism, and that's both confusing and offensive to people who deplore racists but didn't go to Oberlin and aren't up on all of the standards. While I don't think all of the legislative proposals aimed at purging, quote, CRT from public schools are excessive, this debate also clarifies that both the contemporary left and right are home to increasing factions of neo-Tipper-Goreism. I'm a free speech absolutist, but I think there are reasonable arguments against that position. The key is just being honest about it. The ACLU is as good an example as any, employing people who literally campaign for book bans these days. It's fine to argue Target shouldn't carry books like Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage. Doing it under the banner of the ACLU, however, is pretty troubling. Michael Knowles is one of the most popular young thought leaders on the right. His new book, Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, intentionally seeks to reverse the conservative movement's perceived overreaction to political correctness. As the PC movement was co-opted by the far left, conservatives strayed further from the decency movement of the religious right, argues Knowles. Conservatives have failed to thwart political correctness because they mistake it for a campaign of censorship against free speech rather than a contest between two competing standards of speech and behavior. But even this description does not do justice to the cleverness of political correctness, which aims to erect new standards, then destroy the old ones, Knowles argued recently in Newsweek. Political correctness may be understood in this way to be a sort of anti-standard standard, this is Knowles again, which succeeds just as surely by persuading people to abandon standards altogether, for instance, in the name of, quote, free speech absolutism, as it does by impelling acquiescence to its ever-changing dictates. Own it! As I wrote back in May, quote, the murkily defined cancel culture is becoming increasingly useless as a category because the left and right are becoming increasingly aware that some things truly warrant cancellation, that moral codes matter, whether you side with Tipper Gore or Jessica Valenti. I don't think it's the government's role to fire liberal professors, nor do I think employers should generally punish employees like, say, James Damore from Google, but I think we should be working to alleviate alienation and secularism. A leftist, however, might want government and business to create a culture that shames any future Damores from committing wrongthing in the first place. So the debate over critical race theory is, of course, corrupted by the incentives that dominate our media and politics, but it's also not merely a sideshow. Racism is an enduring and tragic element of our lives. White privilege is real, even if its benefits can sometimes be overstated. Again, if we take a step back from the daily fray over CRT, we see two things. One, that much of the conflict stems from conflicting definitions, and two, that much of the conflict also stems from a lack of awareness when it comes to the legal and cultural goals of both the left and the right. The populist hatred of political correctness has inspired both sides to wrap their causes in the banner of maximum freedom. So with this broadened aperture, we see the politics of decadence, of a stagnant society with rotting institutions that spills more digital ink than it exerts real power. Referring to the, quote, deadlocks of our time, Ross Douthat argued, quote, the Kavanaugh affair replaying the Clarence Thomas hearings, the debates over political correctness cycling us backwards to fights that were fresh and new in the 1970s and 80s, the hysteria with which we're experiencing them, he wrote, may represent nothing more than the way that a decadent society manages its political passions by encouraging people to play act extremism, to reenact the 1930s or 1968 on social media, to approach radical politics as a sport, a hobby, a kick to the body chemistry that doesn't put anything in their relatively comfortable late modern lives at risk. So much of our divisive political conflicts are driven by decadent elites, by the tyranny of jargon, as I discussed last month on this program, by cowardly keyboard warriors who shrink when exposed and shield themselves and their corporate and government power with accusations based on inflated definitions of bigotry. It's a way to silence people and to protect themselves, and nobody should let them dilute our collective definitions of important terms like racism to push another version of it that helps them cling to their mantle of moral authority at the expense of the rest of us. Ryan, what do you think about these competing definitions? Do you think that we're operating essentially on different understandings of what terms like racism, anti-racism, and white supremacy and violence actually mean? And that's not to say there aren't some good reasons to expand what we know as racism. Of course there are. But when you have different people in the country, big groups of different people in the country, not agreeing on what constitutes racism, something that is rightfully so stigmatized in this country, that becomes a problem.
Right, but how on earth are you going to get 300 plus million people to agree on a concept that is not just amorphous, but also can be deployed in different contexts? Like there is the specific racism of one person against another, and then there is the broader kind of racism that is just embedded into the entire system. Both of those things are racism, and what the right ends up doing is saying, well, you're talking about this one, but we're talking about this one. Therefore, this entire thing is hysteria, and so we need to ban all of this. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how much of that is in good faith.
Well, so take the Evanston-Skokie curriculum that I just put up there that Chris Rufo found. Would you define that as racism, even though it's it's advertised as anti-racism? But when it says things like accepting that there are inherently inferior characteristics of white people, I mean, that's plainly racism.
So, I mean, I hate all of this HR, Robin DiAngelo, yes, white fragility stuff that gets conflated with critical race theory and with anti-racism. where it's coming from is this idea that whiteness is no longer considered to be an ethnicity or a race. Like, so, there's an academic movement that talks about kind of the wages of whiteness and whiteness equating to a system of white supremacy, and that accepts the reality that non-white people can be part of this system. We don't have a hard time understanding that when it comes to the patriarchy, for instance. Like, the patriarchy is not just kind of contributed to by women, but often women are kind of the foot soldiers of the patriarchy.
I'm so offended. No, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and we don't have a hard time understanding that at all. Like that, we're like, of course, yeah, that these women are bought into some women are bought into this version of the system, and they reproduce it generation after generation, sometimes much more effectively than the men do. That doesn't mean, though, that all of a sudden we're confused about how on earth a woman could be part of a patriarchy, which is a male, kind of named after a male version of a system. So then when you say, well, people of color can actually be participating in a system of white supremacy, sure, obviously that's true. That is easily understandable from an abstract perspective. But then when you take it out of that kind of conversation where people are being thoughtful and exchanging ideas, and you slap it onto a worksheet, and you hand that to a middle school principal, and tell them, this is whiteness. Whiteness is defined as bad. If you haven't been following along the whole time, you just stepped into the middle of the movie, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. You're saying that all of these white people are bad? And then you get into this completely counterproductive conversation,
right?
Which is only productive for Robin DiAngelo to stay on the top of the bestseller list, and for this HR complex to continue to grow its power. So I think that a huge mistake was made along the way that has gotten them to that place.
Well, it also benefits people who exploit those terms to protect and shield themselves. And that happens with a lot of people in corporate media and legacy media who latch onto these things and co-opt them and further confuse this entire conversation. And that's where we get to this conversation about decadence, because we're in this stupid controversy over, as you say, and I said it in the radar, you cannot teach critical race theory to a kindergartner. You can't teach critical race theory and like the actual definition of what critical race theory is to an elementary school student or to a middle school student, let alone like a high school student. That would be difficult enough on its own. So what we're seeing is just this weird, like, watered down version for elementary school kids of people like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi that does come across in a way. It's like these kids cannot understand the like academic roots of what you're teaching them. They can't understand the philosophical underpinnings. The way that it comes across is plain racism. And now we have to have this conversation in the media where you have the corporate stooges who are like rule blue check land, who totally weaponize these terms to protect and shield themselves at the expense of an important conversation, an important debate, and important policies. And that's where we get into this recognition that people on the left and the right are suddenly kind of coming to, which is that, listen, cancel culture, not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, it's good. It would be good for the right to admit that, yeah, they have been champions of cancel culture since the Lavender Scare, since McCarthyism, and have really never let up. They're only complaining now because they're on the losing end of the culture war and are seeing themselves getting canceled. So now they're broadly against cancel culture, except when they're deploying it against Palestinian activists or anybody else. So I think you're right. It's good for them to be honest that this is what they're doing. And when it comes to education curriculum, I think we've just got to remember that Texas Republicans have been trying to kind of censor textbooks for decades. And the advent of critical race theory, which is something that was kind of pushed into the mainstream by Texas Republicans, by Republicans generally, is new, but their desire to whitewash history is old.
I mean, I don't think CRT it was pushed into the mainstream by Republicans. I mean, I think it's that sort of push has very well been owned by the left and by people like Robin DiAngelo, and then all of the corporate outlets that host Ibram X. Kendi on and made his book a bestseller. I think that's where it was pushed into the mainstream and then sort of trickled into curriculums. But I do agree that like the right is absolutely, this is politically expedient culture war fight. We covered just last week Representative Ken Buck noting that.
Right. He thinks they're going to take the House on this.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. And so no, I mean, I think it is politically expedient because normal people around the country don't like it, and that's where the right feels like they've really latched onto something important. But yeah, I mean, listen, like the more people realize that their political philosophy actually does involve using the state to push particular perspectives on history and culture, that's actually we'll arrive at a much more productive place instead of us like all wrapping ourselves in the banner of the First Amendment, because that's simply not what both sides at the end of the day actually want to do. I'm a free speech absolutist. We covered the MILF Mobile last week on the show. That was covered in The Intercept. But the more people can actually be honest about what their political goals are, and the more they can understand that about their political goals, I think we'll be at a much more productive conversation. And
I do think that Buck and the Republicans won't do as well with this as they think, because so many of them are doing this in bad faith to weaponize this. The country is broadly speaking anti-racist, and they're going to expose themselves as not being serious about this.
Yeah, and I'm not even particularly talking about Ken Buck. I mean, Republicans weaponize in bad faith culture war things all of the time. They exploit them and they latch onto them, and that's what the establishment Republicans do. And so on that happy note, I'm really looking forward to what's on your radar next, Ryan.